Hi everybody, Steve Griffiths here, the developer of the MTPredictor software program. In today's MTPredictor video, I'd like to look at our new NinjaTrader7 add-ons that we are going to be releasing in early September for our new tools in MTPredictor. These include our new MTP trend indicator, which will be replacing our old STF indicator, as this goes with the DPs on the higher time frame charts and is therefore a far better indication of the large degree trend. It also includes our Holy Grail trade setup and our VS, our volume spike setup as well. So these should be released in early September. But let's have a look at how they unfold, or how they did on the USE minis yesterday, which was the 24th of August. Let's start with the NQ. Here you can see we had a TS4 sell setup at about 1 o'clock. This was on a MTP red trend, you can see there, therefore indicating the large degree trend was down, therefore it was okay to take short trades. Right mouse click over the red sell bar, using a sample $20,000 account, risking 2%. This would have allowed you to go short 10 contracts. The market came down to the first target where a nice profit of approximately 4.9 or almost 5R was available. These are the kind of trade setups you should be looking for where the profits are large in relation to the initial risk. In other words, you're looking for a trading strategy that has large profits and small losses. Do we have losing trades? Of course we do. It wouldn't be fair to do a video without showing some losing trades. So if we hop over to the ES, you can see a little bit earlier here, this was at 12.18, again on a red STF, so at the time this would have seemed like a perfectly valid and good trade to take, would have been a good one to go short. Let's right mouse click, place the analysis on. You would have been taking into a short trade and then you would have been stopped out. So this would have been a losing trade. I think it's always important to show losing trades, and all vendors should always do this to show the losses as well as the profits. But the important thing is here, this loss, because we use correct position sizing, would have only been one risk unit. In other words, you'd only been losing 1R or one risk unit. I'll just note that down, 1R. The rest of the day, nothing else was going on the ES, all very quiet. You can see there were no other setups there on the ES. Let's skip over to the YM, and here there would have been another sell setup a bit earlier, even at around 11:30. Again, at the time this would have been a valid setup with the MTP10 trend being red. Let's right mouse click, place the analysis on. This went past the 100% initial risk level, so you may have had your stop to break even, but let's take a worst case scenario and again assume that that would be stopped out as well. Again, using correct position sizing, can you see how this time it had only been 8 contracts to keep the initial risk again constant at less than 2% of a sample $20,000 account. So that would have been another minus 1R. So you'd have been short, losing minus 1R. Then on the ES, at this equivalent high here, you'd have been short, losing minus 1R. And then the NQ comes along, and this one here, you would have had a profitable trade of plus 5R. So can you see how good it is to have profitable trades that are much larger than the losses? So minus 1 would have been minus 2R loss, and then plus, can I call it 5? Plus 4.9 plus 5R means you'll be plus 3R profit overall. In other words, profits are large, losses are small. Let's go back to the YM, because for those of you who are astute will have seen there were some other trades later in the day. Let's clear this all off. There would have been a potential buy setup here, but that was on a red MTP trend, so you'd have ignored that. There would have been a TS2 sell here. That would have been on a red trend down to the first target, so for plus 2.1R. Again, the profit greater than the loss earlier. There would have been a buy setup here. Why? Because this is a good indication of how our large degree trend works. Because if I place a DP off that last pivot low, this will show major support. It shows you here major support would coming in at this particular point in time. So you'd be looking to take a trade here. Now what kind of trade was this? Well, off this blue bar it would have been a VS or a volume spike setup that, let's take a worst case scenario, would have been stopped out again from minus 1R. So losses kept small. However, for the more experienced trader, you'd have known that VS or volume spike setups are indications of professionals stepping into the market, and therefore the trend or the trade tends to go with you straight away. In other words, this should actually reverse straight away if it's going to be a good setup. But it didn't. It moved sideways for a bar, then came into another bar, which was the setup bar. This is not the kind of indication that professionals are now coming in and buying the market heavily. So even though you'd have placed the orders probably on this first bar, can you see you were never actually taken in? So in reality, you probably wouldn't have been taken into this particular trade anyway. But it was good indication because can you see how our trend indicator went to black as the market reached this major support, literally on that very bar, to tell you that the market was now in an area where a low was actually possible. The market did go through that and back up again a bit later, but the idea was that it was at an area where support was possible. Let's now have a look at some more advanced analysis on that NQ trade, because from what we've seen so far, we've had some losing trades, the losses kept small, some profitable trades, the loss is much larger than the profit's much larger than the losses. But I want to show you what you can do once you become more experienced with our add-ons. We've already seen on this NQ trade into the first target was a plus 4.9 hour profit. Let's now skip out to the higher time frame chart. On the higher time frame chart, can you see how we had a major high back here? This was the last swing into that pivot high. I very often place DPs on the last swing into highs or lows for areas of potential support or resistance, in this case support. So at the time you'd have placed a DP off this particular low here, and this would have given you an area of potential support. Now remember, this would have been on the chart in advance before the market even gets there. These are leading indicators. So let's now go down to the 3-minute chart and see what difference this makes. So here would have been your support zone, your major support zone, because it came off a 15-minute chart. So the more experienced user here would have said, well, you've had a very big bars coming down into this support level or this first target, so that might indication that selling is entering the market if the market carries on through it. So you might have said, well, actually I don't want to come out here, I want to now go down to our lower support zone or our major support zone, as that is the area of where major support is going to come in. If you did that, your profit would have increased to almost over 13R. So this is the kind of things I encourage users to do, is don't look for any excuse to come out early like this. Don't look for any excuse to come out at your first targets. Look for reasons why there may be further movement in the market, and perhaps use some further targets out to then potentially run your trade further, and as such be able to increase your profit. And this is one thing users find hard, is keeping in the trades, and it's very difficult when you've been a losing trader, because you always want to get out the trade early. In other words, you're always trading what we call scared money. In reality, you'd have been short from 1 o'clock right the way down to here, which would have been 3:15. So that's over 2 hours to be in a short trade. Now some users or some traders find that difficult to be in a trade for such a long time, and this is one of the things you have to develop discipline for as you become more experienced, is allow the trade to run. In other words, give the trade time to increase in profit. In other words, allow the market to actually go somewhere. So this is why it's quite good to have these larger degree support and resistance zones on your chart when you want a more experienced trader to use these for further out targets. But anyway, if you didn't do that and you just come out to the first target, it still would have been a plus 4.9 or almost 5R profit there. So a very, very good trade indeed. So a good day yesterday for MTPredictor with our new MTP trend indicator, calling the trend of the day very nicely, and some very nice setups on the USE minis, in particular this TS4 sell on the NQ. And as we've seen, there were losing trades on some of the other markets, and we've covered those as well in the video. In particular, this TS3 sell on our ES that would have been stopped out for a -1R loss, and then on the YM there would have been a losing trade, no trade, plus 2.1R, then a -1R potentially a bit later on. So not much going on the YM, but again, small losses, big profits. So I'd just like to leave you with the NQ trade, as that was the trade of the day yesterday, where you had a lovely profitable short trade in the direction of the MTP trend colour.